So before we go ahead and create the final unwrapping for all of the environment pieces together, I want to spend some time with this particular piece and insert some seams so that we can unwrap it successfully, and then off screen I will go ahead and insert the seams for all the remaining meshes. You don't need to see me do it for each and every mesh because it's the same procedure. You have to insert the seams, identify the places where you want to put the cuts so that they can unwrap successfully. So if I press the Tab key on the keyboard to enter edit mode for this mesh, you can see that already I've inserted some seams in the places where I've inserted it before for the other mesh, the other wall mesh. So here I've got the seams for the pillar and the seams where the floor meets the wall, but this mesh, because it contains more detail, needs more seams. So for example, here on this wall area we have these extrusions, these boxes that protrude out of the wall. So I'm going to make sure I'm in edge mode and select these edges here around the perimeter, and also these edges around the perimeter. And in my toolbox here I will scroll down to the UV mapping section and choose Mark Seam to create a seam for those pieces. I also am going to insert some seams here at the corner pieces so this can unwrap successfully. So again here, insert some seams for these 4 corner pieces. So another one here and there, and then choose Mark Seam. So we have some seams there for these pieces, and that's looking pretty good. So we also have the floor area here. So we're going to have quite a few seams here because I'm going to be mirroring the mapping and overlapping the UVs so that I can texture just one piece and all of the pieces will have that texture mapping. So we'll see how that works shortly. So what I'm going to do is select this edge and then hold down Control and Alt on the keyboard and select the second edge. And what that does is you can see now it has found the edge loop all the way around here and has selected all of those edges together. And then I'm going to choose Mark Seam. So now there's a seam here. And I'm going to repeat that procedure again for the bottom edge loop, so holding down Control and Alt to select that second edge loop and choose Mark Seam. I'm going to do the same for these 2 edge loops here, so I'm going to hold down Control and Alt to select the one around here, choose Mark Seam, and the same for the edge loop below and choose Mark Seam. So we've marked those seams there. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to insert some seams around here so that I can overlap these corner pieces together. So I'm going to select this edge here and this edge and this one. And I'm also going to select this one, and this one. I'm going to move over to the other side and basically do the same thing. So select that edge, and that one. And again, over here, I'm going to be selecting that edge, and that one. I'm going to choose Mark Seam so that we mark those edges there. And again, I'm going to move over to the other side and repeat that procedure. So select those edge loops, these ones here, that one there, and there. Move over to the other side and select this edge, and this edge, and this edge. And this one, and this one, and again choose Mark Seam to mark in those seams. I'm also going to add a seam over here in the middle so that I can reflect the UV mapping on both sides. So again, select this edge, and this edge like so, and choose Mark Seam. I could come across here, I guess, and also add a seam there if I wanted to. Right now I'm going to leave that out. So here I've gone ahead and just marked in all the critical seams that we need. So let's apply unwrapping to this. So I'm going to switch to face mode. Actually, I'm going to switch to the UV editing mode. Make sure I choose all faces in this mesh. Choose Mesh, UV Unwrap, and then Unwrap, and you can see that now all of our faces have been unwrapped. So we've got our separate UV islands that you can see here. Let's just switch to textured mode like so. I'm going to create a new UV grid here for this mapping. So just switch off alpha, turn on UV grid, choose OK, You can see that mapping on here now, and everything's looking pretty good, including the mapping on the floor here, the mapping on these protrusions. So that's all looking pretty good. Next what I'm going to tackle is the process of unwrapping everything for our environment pieces. So now it's time to unwrap all of these pieces together. And off screen what I've done is I've assembled all the different pieces that I've modeled together on one layer, which is this layer here, and I have separated them apart on the grid. So I've used incremental snapping to just offset the different meshes onto different parts of the grid. They're snapped nicely to the grid sections here. And then I've just combined all of those separate meshes together using the join command that we have seen before, so that I've joined all the separate mesh pieces into one mesh. This is going to be important when we do our unwrapping, because we want to unwrap all of these pieces together and arrange their UVs inside a single texture space. So now let's try and unwrap all of these together. Now you'll see if I go into edit mode by pressing the tab key, you can see that I've inserted the seams for all the different pieces. So we have our floor piece here, another floor piece here, the crate props, some wall sections, the inward corner, the outward corner over here, and some more straight sections. So what I'm going to do now is switch over to UV editing to bring up the UV editor. We can see we have our modular pieces over here. We're in the texture shading mode here, and right now everything is white because they don't have any UVs at all. We're going to change that now. So I'm going to enter edit mode and switch to the face mode and select all of the faces in this mesh, and then choose mesh, UV unwrap and UV unwrap. And what this does is it unwraps all of the UVs and squishes them all inside a single texture space that you can see here, and you can now see the grid pattern on all of the mesh pieces. And if I maximize the UV editor, you can see that what has happened is we have all of these UV shells, these islands, just packed into exactly the same texture space. And in fact, looking at it quite like this really makes it rather confusing. It's difficult to know which piece refers to which piece on the mesh. So we're going to try to make some sense of all these UVs before we go any further. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to try to isolate all the UVs on a per mesh basis. So for example, let's say I'm going to switch to face mode and select all of the faces for this mesh here. So now I've selected all of the faces for this straight section piece. And when I've done that, you can see over here in the UV editor, if I press Shift Spacebar to maximize that, you can see that it's now showing me all of the UVs that are associated with that mesh piece. And in fact, all the different pieces are sort of spread apart all over the UV space. Now I want to try to introduce some organization into these UVs. So what I'm going to do is right click and choose vertex mode, and I'm going to select all the different pieces, press W to translate these, and I'm going to start to bring them together in a kind of square space. So let's select this piece, press W to transform it, again select this piece, W to sort of transform that, and I'm going to transform that piece as well, and this piece, and this piece. Again, let's bring this piece over here, this piece over here, and now I can select all of them and just bring them outside here and just separate them so that they're all over here together. And what I've done now is I've isolated those UVs for this piece. If I now press Ctrl A to select all faces, you can see everything has their UVs in this UV space here, except for this piece, and its UVs are organized and arranged over here. I'm not planning to keep those pieces here, but I'm just separating them out so that we can get some organization into here. So now what I'm going to do is select a new piece, let's say for example this wall piece over here, and you can see it selects those UVs for this piece here. So let's start to again repeat that procedure, bring them into here in one sort of square, and this piece over here, bring that into here. Again, bring this piece into here. Let's just zoom in a bit. They're quite close together, some of these pieces. Bring this over here and this one over here. And again, we've got another piece organized, and I'm just going to bring that off to the side as well. Press Shift Space to return back. And again, I'm going to repeat this procedure for every single piece, just separating their UVs out into isolation so I know which pieces are which. And I'll resume recording, or I will start the next video after I've completed that process. So I'm going to go ahead and complete that off screen. So off screen, I've gone ahead and isolated all the separate UV pieces for each of these different elements of the mesh, and you can see them all here in the UV editor. And the next stage of the process is really overlapping and consolidation. And what do I mean by that? Well, let me show you. For example, let's choose a piece. Let's say, for example, let's just zoom in here and see what we can find. Let's take, for example, this mesh piece here. So this section of the mesh, you can see this here. We have this sort of wall section. Now let me just press Shift Space Bar so that I can turn off the transparency for this mesh and we can see it in a kind of solid display. So we have our wall mesh and these two interior elements here. Now let's press Shift Space Bar and go back to the UV editor. Those two recesses correspond, let's select Island, to this piece and this piece. You can see that these two pieces are these center elements, and when I move them you can see the UVs moving here in the viewport. Now both of these pieces are really kind of the same thing, and I don't want to have to paint two lots of texture data into each of these. So instead I can make these two pieces overlap so they share the same texture space. This really is a way of economizing on texture space. So let's have a look. I'm going to just maximize this viewport here. And again, we can begin to start transforming these. I can, for example, select the vertices and move them independently, but I'm going to stick with islands for now, and I'm going to be using snapping to overlap these two pieces. So, for example, let's take a look here. I'm going to activate the snapping tool and make sure I select vertex and choose closest. And just press W on the keyboard to start snapping this in place. And here, voila, these two pieces overlap exactly. So that's looking pretty good. Now, of course, we can also find some other areas where we can overlap them. For example, take this piece and this piece. I'm going to press Shift Space Bar. These two pieces here refer to the sides of the pillars that you can see here, and the other side is here. So this really is just the mirror image of this piece. So what I want to do is select this island here and choose UVs and choose mirror, and I want to mirror on the x-axis like this. And now again I can come in and use my snapping to overlap those two pieces. And again, this piece here is the front here, the pillar, and also the pillar on this side is represented by this one. So again, I can do some snapping here, and now I've consolidated those pieces together, and we have some overlapping between these elements. Now, the overlapping doesn't have to stop here. What I've done here is just simply overlap two different elements within the same sort of mesh area. But I can extend outwards to the other meshes and overlap those pieces. And let me show you what I mean. I'm going to select all of the faces in here and Shift Spacebar to maximize this view. Take, for example, this piece that we've already selected for the side of the pillar. Well, in fact, I could go hunting around in these UVs and find, aha, we've got another pillar piece here, which is this one. And that represents the pillar section for the mesh over here. But we know that all of these pillar sections are pretty much exactly the same thing. So even between all of these separate pieces, we can overlap them together. So I'm going to select this piece, and I'm just going to move it down into this section here. Select this piece, move it down into this section. Let's just turn off snapping. And again, I'm going to go hunting around. Let's see if we can find any more like that piece. I think that may be all of them. No, it isn't. No, it isn't. There are some more here. So I'm going to select these pieces and sort of transport them over to this side. And again, I can then start to reflect these pieces. So UVs, mirror, x-axis, UVs with this one, mirror, x-axis, turn on snapping again, and I can start snapping them all into position and overlap them all in this way. And in this way I can overlap every single common element. So off screen I'm going to start overlapping all of these pieces, and when I've done that I'm going to assemble them back into this square to create a nice unique layout for all of our mesh pieces. So I'll resume recording in the next video when I've done that. So off screen I've consolidated and arranged all of the UVs into one single consistent texture space, overlapping all of the common elements so that I can really economize on that texture space and make sure that everything is optimized. So let's just take a look at how I've done this. Let's go over to the UV editor and I'll press Shift Spacebar on the keyboard, and you can see all of these UVs arranged here. Now, one thing I want to point out is you'll notice that I've not really aligned the UVs to the very edges of the texture. I've allowed a certain margin of pixel space between the UVs and the edges of the texture, and that's generally good practice. That's going to help your textures look as good as possible. Also, I've allowed some spacing between the different UV islands, and that's also good practice. Don't try to align them right up against one another. That's really not a good idea. Leave at least some margin of space between them. Also notice that, again, arranging these UV islands, I've arranged them in a kind of row and column format. You'll see that horizontally from left to right here, these UVs represent the floor pieces of our environment. And again, along in this row we have all of the lower walls for the environment, and here we have the upper walls. So that's going to make it really easy for me to kind of paint along in one line when I bring these into GIMP and paint our textures. So that said, here we have our UV layout, and what I want to do now is export this UV layout to a file, to an image file. And we're going to be using that file as a kind of reference when we start painting our texture. So I'm going to select all of these UVs here. I'm going to select face mode, press Ctrl A to select all of those UVs. And to export them to a file, I'm going to choose UVs and export UV layout. Select that from the menu. I'm going to give this a file name of just UV and layout, like so. And I'm going to scroll down so we can set the properties for this file. I'm going to make sure that PNG format is selected. And for the dimensions of the file, I'm going to set this to be 2048. Width and height, so 2048 again, and accept those changes. And I'm going to press Export UV Layout here, just to export that UV layout, and then it creates a file for us. I'm just going to bring in a Windows Explorer window that you can see here, and here we have the UV layout file. So I'm going to choose Preview, and you can see here we have the preview of this file. So there is our UV layout, and that's ready to import into an image editor. So things are looking pretty good. So in this video I want to show you how you can bake an ambient occlusion map for your environment pieces. Now, what is ambient occlusion? Effectively, it's going to simulate indirect illumination, or at least it's going to simulate one symptom of it. In particular, it's going to simulate contact shadows, and what that means is, for example, where the floor meets the wall, it's going to add some variation to our value. So it's going to add some shadows into here to simulate how lighting bouncing around in the real world might work. Effectively, what this does is it's going to vary the levels, the value in our environment, and it will add a certain amount of volume and 3D-ness, and it can really make our environment look much better. So let's see how we're going to create an ambient occlusion map. The first thing I'm going to do is move over here and choose Image and New Image. I'm going to create a new image in the image editor, which is going to be the image containing our ambient occlusion map. So I'm going to call this AO map, and I'm going to set the size to 2048 by 2048. It's going to match the dimensions of our UV layout. I'll disable alpha but leave the generated type as blank and click OK. And immediately this creates a black sort of image here that we can't really see anything on at all. So I'm just going to switch back to object mode and select all the objects in our environment. Right now it's completely black and you can't really see anything going on there. I'm going to open up a new panel on the right hand side here. Actually, not that one, beg your pardon, it's the diagonal crosses here. So I'm going to open up that to duplicate a new panel in here. Right now this is set as user perspective, but we can easily change that by clicking on the drop down here, and from this I'm going to select properties to display the familiar properties panel that we've seen before. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over here to the World tab, and I want to enable ambient occlusion, and I'm also going to enable environment lighting, and I'm going to change the gather type from ray trace to approximate. Then I'm going to switch over to the Render tab and scroll down until we see the section called Bake. I'll open up that section, and in the Bake mode I'm going to change this from full render to ambient occlusion, like so. Now when I click the Bake button, you'll see that the ambient occlusion will be generated for the selected objects, and it will be drawn onto the texture that we have in the image editor here. So I'm going to choose Bake. And there we have the completed ambient occlusion map, and you can see the pieces in the viewport here and the kind of effect this is having. You can see the sort of smooth transition in value across the surfaces here, and the kind of contact shadows we're having where the wall meets the floor, and it really gives a kind of smooth 3D-ness volume to the environment. So this ambient occlusion map, I'm going to export this to a standard image file, and later when creating the texture we'll blend this on top. So to export this image I'm going to choose Image and Save as Image, and again we get the image save dialog. I'm going to accept this as aomap.png. I'm going to leave all these settings at their defaults, and then I'm going to choose Save as Image to save that image, and just bring into view a Windows Explorer window, and we can see the ambient occlusion file generated here along with our UV layout which we exported earlier. So that's how we can go ahead and create an ambient occlusion map. So I've moved over here into GIMP, and I'm in the multi-window mode, which you can get to by choosing Windows and multi-window. Right now it says single window mode because this is a toggleable feature, which means that the different windows of the interface are kind of loose and I can just move them around how I want. And this is a really useful way to work if you have a multi-monitor setup, as I do. So again, here we've got this window, and it's a completely new image that I'm going to be creating. This is going to represent the beginning of our texture we're going to be making for our Blender environment. You can create a new image just by choosing File, New, and really just type in the values that you need. So this is a 2048 by 2048 texture, but it's a completely blank background. Now I'm going to be loading in the ambient occlusion map that we've generated along with our UVs. So to do that I'm just going to bring in a Windows Explorer window, which you can see here. I'm just going to move this down a bit, and I'll drag and drop the ambient occlusion map into our image. And it's added to the image as a new layer. You can see that in the layers panel we have the AO map, and I'm going to be just bringing in now the other UV layout, dragging and dropping that into the environment. Let's just get rid of the Windows Explorer window, and you can see now we have our UVs. I'm going to change the blending mode for our UVs to be multiply. So I'm going to select multiply so that now they just appear on top of the environment. They're always going to be at the very top so that we can always see these UVs and know what we're painting into for our texture. And I'm just going to scroll into the image, and what you can see here in our image is we've got, let's take a look here. We've got our UVs overlaid, and the ambient occlusion here is slightly bleeding out of the UVs, and that gives us a good indication of the kind of pixel bleed that we'll need when painting in the pixels for our texture. So what I want to do first of all is kind of isolate a new region. So I'm going to isolate, for example, the floor of our environment. Actually, first thing I'm going to do is perhaps I'm going to just lighten up the effect of the ambient occlusion. Maybe I don't want it quite so strong. So I'm going to select the ambient occlusion layer and change the opacity here. I'm going to just maybe reduce this to, I don't know, maybe about 50, maybe a bit darker than that, maybe perhaps 70 or thereabouts, maybe a bit darker. So maybe something like that perhaps. And I'm also going to set the background here. I'm going to fill this with black. So I'm going to select the background, make sure that black is selected, and press Alt backspace just to fill that there with black. I want a black background. So that's okay. So what I'm going to do now is start to really just paste in some values for the floor. So we've got our floor here, and I'm going to mark out, I'm going to select the marquee selection tool, and I'm going to mark out a region for the floor. So let's say about this kind of region here. I'm going to try and match it up to the UVs, the UV guide here. So about there is the height of the floor, from about there, and I'm going to drag that selection all the way over to the left hand side of the image. So maybe about there, and that represents the selection for the floor. Now what I want to do is I want to save that selection. This represents all the floor units, so I want to save that selection. You can see here in the selection editor, which you can display by choosing Windows Dockable Dialogues and choose the selection editor. So I have this selection editor, and the white represents my selection in the image. I'm going to save that selection. You can do it by choosing this button here to save the selection as a channel, and again it creates a new channel here based on your selection. I'm just going to name this edge floor, like so. So now that selection is permanently saved, which means that if I deselect it, for example, and I lose that selection, I can always get this selection back just by holding down the Alt key on the keyboard and clicking on that thumbnail. So now I get the selection back. So that's looking fine. We've got sort of a selection for our floor here. So for the floor, what I want to do basically is just fill this with the kind of bold base color that we're going to be using to start generating details. So I've got the floor selected, and I'm going to create a new layer to house the pixels for the floor. So I'm going to move over here to create a new layer, and we get the new layer dialog. I'm going to leave that background to be transparency, and I'm going to name the layer L floor. I'm prefixing it with the letter L to indicate that it's a layer, and choose OK. So we get layer floor. It appears on top of the UV layout. I don't want that. I want it to be underneath the UV, so I'm going to move that downwards. So here we've got the floor underneath the UV layout, and I want to fill that with some pixels. So I'm going to move over to the color picker here, and I'm just going to choose a color, or maybe that kind of shade of grey, maybe fairly dark, something perhaps like that, and choose OK, and I'll press Alt backspace to fill that colour. So there we've got a sort of basic dark shade for the floor. So off screen I'm going to come in and do something similar for the wall pieces and the basic floor pieces and so on. Just assign them some base colours from which we begin to add detail.